evening to everyone. And I think firstly, Fred, to you, thanks for organizing such forums and conversations. I think they're very, very important. So the theme really was around how government and the private sector is pulling together to try and assist in this COVID period. And funding is really only one element of all this assistance programs that's going on. So I'm going to zone in a bit onto the funding elements. Just some context, Business Partners has been funding SMEs for a long time, over 39 years now. And we've plowed about 18 billion rand into SMEs over that period. So I think we've learned a thing or two about funding SMEs over that period, some valuable lessons. But tonight's really all about how we are assisting and others in funding SMEs in this difficult time in terms of the relief fund. So I'm just going to do a bit of a taste of what the funding landscape looked like pre-COVID, what it looks like at the moment, and what I expect it to look like after the COVID period. So I don't think people often appreciate that the funding landscape in South Africa is quite diverse. It's quite complex. There are a range of funders playing very different roles, from bankers, family and friends, a nice healthy angel investor network, the government and DFIs, nice mature private equity market, venture capitalists, not as mature as other parts of the world, but there certainly are strong elements of it. Bootstrapping is just a nice way for funding your own growth. And then crowdfunding becoming more and more prominent together with enterprise development programs. That's kind of what the landscape looked like pre-COVID. But today, really, I want to focus a bit more on the funding of relief funds or the funding relief fund programs that exist currently. And the problem, I guess, for many people in the country is that the various programs are quite fragmented. Information is quite fragmented. So you have to go and hunt for all these different programs, maybe a good opportunity for somebody to pull them all together. So not one central point where people can access it at the moment. And I'm going to touch briefly on some of the more prominent ones, certainly not all of them. But what you can find in the market at the moment in the form of funding is two different types of schemes. The one is payment relief, and that's normally deferment of some kind of payment obligation. The banks have been quite prominent in it, as well as some of the landlords, insurance companies, where they are either giving you a total benefit of non-payment or deferral of that payment, and various landlords and insurance companies and so on have different types of relief schemes. The other one is where additional capital is plowed into the businesses to support overheads for the next 3 to 4 months. And in this case, there are specific programs which consists of grants. And those are nice ones to have because there's no repayment. And the others are normally loans with quite soft terms. We're going to touch on a few of them very briefly. The first one is the SUKUMA fund administered by Business Partners. It's a R1 billion fund. I'm not going to go into the criteria in detail. At the end of all the various schemes, I will just touch on what the common threads are. But this one consists of loan and grant portions. This information will be made available by Heavy Chef after within the next day or two. So this is the first one. That's R1 billion that's administered by us Business Partners, and we are also trying to cover overheads for the next 3 or 4 months. The second one is the Department of Labour, and they've got their UIF scheme, which employees could contact them directly. They're on the verge of releasing the temporary employer relief scheme, and this is where employers can apply. This one's not live yet, but will go in the next few days, also in the form of a grant, and where very specific documentation has to be submitted. The debt relief scheme, which is run by the Department of Small Business Development, a 500 million rand fund, also targeting SMEs and micro enterprises. A bit more in terms of the criteria. It's loan based, also with soft terms, but they didn't really specify any minimums and maximums. Also, quite a bit of information you need to submit, and I'll touch a bit on that towards the end. The South African Future Trust, this is the Oppenheimers that's also being administered by the bank. It's a R1 billion fund. which was put together by the Oppenheimer family. This one's linked specifically to the payment of employees at 750 Rand per week for 15 weeks or so. No directors can claim, but a maximum of up to 15 million. This is normally also in the form of a loan at 0% interest. There are some criteria here as well, which I'll touch on at the end in broad, as I've mentioned. The contact details of each of these programs are at the bottom of each slide, which you can access. There's also some specific industry-focused programs. Of such an example is the Department of Tourism, the 200 million Rand fund, 50,000 Rand per beneficiary. This is covering a whole range. If you look at the top line, broad accommodation, hospitality, travel, that includes guest houses, boutique hotels, that kind of stuff. It is in the form of a grant, so you don't have to pay it back. And is actually, if you think about 50,000 Rand in a hotel, it's actually aimed towards the smaller operators, but includes hospitality, restaurants, formal conferencing, catering, those kinds of businesses. The National Empowerment Fund, this one is specifically for taking up opportunities to combat the COVID-19, including things like distribution, manufacture of PPE equipment, those kinds of opportunities. The minimum and maximum size, 500,000 to 10 million. You will need some form of indication of an order, contract, intent of some sort to be able to access this kind of funding. If I go back, this is also in the form of debt, 0% interest and 2.5% thereafter. You can see really, really soft terms. The Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development also has a program. I speak under correction, but this may already be closed. And this is really aimed at small communal farmers, also in the form of a grant, maximum of 50,000. So those are really some of the schemes. The latest one, the 200 billion Rand guarantee scheme, which is underwritten by the government or guaranteed by the government up to about 94%. But the banks are being used to administer this fund. Each bank will have its own criteria, and you can see at the bottom most of the major banks, in fact, all of the major banks are involved, and you can approach them directly. And this is targeting SMEs with a turnover of less than 300 million. This is really the point that I want to get to. So all these schemes, the common threads are: make sure you have up-to-date financial statements, make sure that you are able to prove that you have been impacted by the COVID-19, make sure that you are tax compliant, make sure that you are statutory compliant. Those are the key metrics, the key requirements in most of those schemes, and the common threads throughout. So the first point I really want to make, and this has come from a lot of the applications that we've dealt with as well, is make sure you have up-to-date financials signed off. You've got all your statutory documentation in place, MOIs, CK documents, share registers, bank confirmation letters, all those administrative documents. Make sure you've got them on file, and it's been made quite easy for you to access them from the banks and SARS and so on. Be honest and open. They will do credit checks. They will pull TransUnion, ITC, or Experian reports to have a look at your credit history. Something we've come across quite often is not everything's put in writing, even when dealing with friends and family. When a family member borrows you money, make sure that you put it in writing. It's documented, it's governed. If anything happens to that person, the estate doesn't call it up. It does pose your business risk, and a funder will look at it as a risk that you need to cover. This is a point, just as I was thinking, that nobody's going to knock on your door and give you relief funding, write out a check and give you relief funding. You really need to make the effort. As I explained, every scheme is different. Make sure you approach the ones that match your need best. And if you don't make the effort to approach these funders, somebody else is going to, and they're going to benefit from it. So you really need to get off your behind, if I can say it that way, and approach these funders, do your research, and make sure that your application is relevant to the funder. Most of the applications are being driven through technology, so make sure you have adequate technology, good bandwidth, to be able to communicate, upload documents, submit applications, and deal with the correspondence efficiently. Ensure bank accounts and others are well managed, certainly up to the point of the COVID impact. Funders are aware that you will be impacted by COVID, so they want to know that you had a viable business prior to the COVID impact. And then make sure you understand obligations and the covenants that come with the funding. What are the clauses that's important? What's the interest rates? Are there settlement early penalty clauses? Those sorts of things. Ensure you're tax compliant and statutory compliant. Make sure your CIPC fees are paid and up to date. Those sorts of things. And then really to the letter, ensure that your application submission is complete. If you can consider the volumes that funders have to deal with, they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to follow up. Sorry, but you need this and that in addition. So make sure that you are obedient, for the lack of a better word, to the application submission requirements and that it is complete as specifically prescribed. So in summary, ensure you have a viable business pre and post-COVID. More pre, that you can prove you did indeed have a profitable business. Ensure that you are a good corporate citizen by making sure that you're tax compliant, statutory compliant, all your fees are paid and licenses are in place. And then ensure that your application is relevant and complete. So when you do approach a funder and there are only funding overheads, make sure that your motivation of application is indeed relevant from that perspective. So that's kind of the landscape at the moment. Many schemes around. Do your homework. There's lots of information all over the place, but make sure you take time to go through each one in great detail. And then what I think the funding landscape will look like post-COVID, a lot of IP systems and processes have been developed that funders will continue to use going forward. And it's forced them in a way to do that. We experienced very similar, we had a very similar experience. So I think the evolution of fintech companies will be accelerated into the future. There will be an entry of smaller funders. We've seen that already into the market. More and more digital application submissions. I think less visiting the bank and dealing with your banker from that perspective. Funders will start to develop electronic methodologies and tools of doing their due diligence and verification. I think there will still be a place for traditional funders. That will remain still for time to come. I don't see that changing immediately or in the short term. Crowdfunding playing an increasingly more and more important role. Still a slow offtake in South Africa, but that will improve and increase as the character or entrepreneurial type changes as we move into this modern entrepreneur who wants things done more from a digital perspective. I think that will become more and more. And then lots of IP and systems developed, as I mentioned, by funders for speedier and more efficient turnaround times into the future. As entrepreneurs, I understand that funding needs and opportunities are there. We can't wait 4 months for a turnaround. And I think the systems and IP that's been developed recently will assist into the future. So that's it from me. I mean, I can spend all day talking about these programs. Unfortunately, the time is limited, but I wish to thank you for your audience. And as a last point, I know times are tough. When the times are really dark, you want to throw in the towel. Please don't. The country needs you. Your staff needs you. The position is temporary, and put yourself in the best position to see it through. That's it from me. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was amazing. Very succinct, very concise, and very instructive. I really appreciate your time and the effort that you put into creating this presentation.